heard about abusive priests before, and the scandals of the Catholic Church have been well documented. But what happens when a nun won't put up with it anymore? Many argue that one such woman, Sister Catherine, was silenced by the Church. Others say that her death was completely unrelated. In a lengthy, complex cover-up today, we're going to be diving deep into the disturbing history of the Archdiocese of Baltimore and how their injustices still affect the victims to this day. So, hello and welcome to Prism of the Past, a semi-weekly series all about historical events, people, and situations, from the fascinating to the forgotten. I'm the iilluminaughtii, and today's episode was actually recommended to me via email many months ago, and I've got to say, it's one of the most interesting and convoluted recommendations I've gotten in some time. And by that, I mean that this case is so in-depth and strange that there's a 7-hour-long Netflix series on the topic, and it's called The Keepers. Today we're going to be talking about a priest called Joseph Maskell. He served the Archdiocese of Baltimore only to be removed for sexual misconduct. Yet, strangely and even more upsetting still, many believe that he's guilty of more, murdering a nun to silence her. Considering that there is a 7-hour-long documentary about this case, I doubt we'll be able to cover every single detail in depth, but I'm going to do the absolute best I can. As a disclaimer, today's episode will obviously contain graphic details of what happened here, so if you're not in the right space to hear about those things, sexual misconduct and homicide, then I recommend skipping this one. For those of you sticking around, let's get right into it. Today's episode is long and twisted, so before I even get into what the hell happened, I want to introduce you to two people that play a major role in the story we're about to tell: Catherine Cesnik and Joseph Maskell. Sister Cathy was born on November 17, 1942, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She graduated the top of her high school class in 1960 and went on to become a Catholic religious sister and taught English. One of her former students in this documentary remembers her as being an excellent teacher that even assigned her students the book The Scarlet Letter. According to one woman, Deb Silcox, she simply exuded kindness, she encouraged people to become a better person, and she made English class enjoyable. Two students in particular, Abby and Gemma, continue to pursue the case to this day. Abby digs up any information she can, and Gemma, described as a grandmother Nancy Drew, is shown in the documentary going around and knocking on doors looking for answers. Cathy had an incredible impact on them, there's no doubt whatsoever. I know that there are articles and horror stories about nuns in the classroom out there, and I'm not trying to diminish anyone's experiences, but the fact that Sister Cathy's former students still speak adoringly of her after so many decades have passed speaks volumes. As for Anthony Joseph Maskell, he grew up in Baltimore and was ordained back in 1965. According to an old article from the Baltimore Sun, besides teaching at Keogh, he held posts in several local parishes: Sacred Heart of Mary, St. Clement, Our Lady of Victory, Annunciation, and Holy Cross. In 1972, he earned a master's degree in school psychology from Townsend State University and then a certificate of advanced study in counseling from the Johns Hopkins University. It's actually been said that he was removed from the Keogh all-girls school after receiving complaints, and the new principal, a no-nonsense type, had him removed. Though some called him a priest in later years, a fine priest, intelligent, and a hard worker, former students say that that's not 100% true. They say that Father Maskell would learn things about their behavior, like drug use or sexual activity, things that teenagers wouldn't want their parents to know about. Then, after approaching them on the guise of care and counseling, Father Maskell would blackmail them to stay silent and make sexual demands. Though the massive scandal within the Catholic Church erupted in the early 2000s and all these sexual abuse scandals just leaked out, former students say that back then it was unheard of. Nobody would believe that. A woman who knew Father Maskell from his days at Holy Cross Church in South Baltimore used the same term, calling the priest a little weird. He bragged about having pistols and how he was telling people off. "I didn't want no truck with him. He was a real oddball," she said. She said her encounters with Father Maskell were never sexual, but were nonetheless unsettling. "He is hung up on the military," she said. "He used to get me in his office and make me wear his helmet and tell me military stories." We're going to get into the scandal against Maskell later, but for now, I want to try and keep things in order. Otherwise, I'll get into just this mess all too fast. All you need to know is that back in the late 60s, Sister Cathy was an amazing teacher and Father Maskell was the one you wanted to avoid at all costs. Sister Cathy and Sister Russell were roommates together in 1969. Sister Cathy had worked at Archbishop Keough High School where Maskell worked, though at the time where the story begins, she was on a sabbatical from the Catholic Church and was teaching at Western High School in Baltimore City. She had only taken temporary vows, not final ones yet. On November 7th of that year, Cathy was seen leaving her apartment off to get an engagement present for her sister at the Edmondson Village Shopping Center nearby. This area was considered safe, an upscale attraction, and there's proof that Cathy was there. She cashed her paycheck, brought some dinner rolls, but she never entered her apartment again. One reporter interviewed for the documentary says that they had no idea where she was snatched, whereas the two former students that have dug into this case say differently. An airline stewardess that lived near Cathy was bringing groceries into the house, making multiple trips in and out, and around 8:30 p.m., the stewardess claims to have spotted Cathy in her car that night. Mary Spence, another witness, says that she was nearby around the time that she heard a loud, booming, angry yell, a man's voice about this time, coming from the direction of Cathy's apartment. By 11 p.m., Sister Russell, her roommate, was concerned that she hadn't returned. However, rather than call the police, the first person she called was another teacher, named Gerald Koob. Some say this is troubling, and I don't want to speculate why Russell didn't call the police at first. Maybe she was simply trying to have Koob talk her down. A former priest himself, Jerry Koob, would later confess to having a sexual relationship with Cathy, though in the documentary he doesn't address this much, though he discusses how he did love her and even proposed, but was turned down. Anyway, after he and another priest, Pete McKeon, heard word from Russell that Cathy was missing, they drove straight to the apartment the two women shared. Once they shared the story, and once it was clear Cathy wasn't coming home, they called the police. It was about 1 a.m. this time. The two men decided to take a walk and very quickly discovered Cathy's car. It was parked oddly with muddy tires. According to one source, at 4:40 a.m., Reverend Maskell found Sister Sesnick's unlocked car, a green 1970 Maverick, at the 4500 block of Carriage Court. Other reports have Sister Russell and Reverend Koob also finding the car with Reb Maskell. The vehicle was towed to the city's Southwestern District Station. Police had received several calls about the oddly parked vehicle. The car was processed by the crime lab. In the vehicle, police found a box of buns purchased at Muley Bakery, which was located in the Hecht Company store in Edmondson Village, along with leaves and twigs. Branches had been caught in the car's radio antenna. A twig hooked with yellow thread was found on a turn signal lever. And it made no sense to anyone. Why would Cathy leave her keys still in the ignition? Those close to her were worried, as Cathy wouldn't park her car that way. November 9th and 10th, police checked leads, tips, knocked on doors, and searched through alleyways to no avail. On November 11th, police said they had no reason to believe she was kidnapped, despite the strange way in which her car was found. But then, something else happened. Joyce Helen Malachi, 20 years old, went missing November 11th when she left home to go shopping in Glen Burnie. 1 day later, her abandoned, unlocked car was found, keys still in the ignition. Tragically, the day after that, her body was discovered too, floating in the Little Patuxent River by 2 deer hunters. It's said that the government won't release information on this case, even when former students Abby and Gemma have filed under the Freedom of Information Act. Yet, there were enough similarities between these two cases, especially considering how soon after the other they happened. Captain John Barnold, chief of homicide, was running the investigation. From day one, Barnold tried to reassure the public. The longer she was missing, the more he suspected foul play, but he says he didn't want to advertise that either. I understand that he was overwhelmed with cases, but I can also understand the incredible frustration from those that wanted answers. After all, it's important to start asking those hard questions before her case fades from the public eye. And some short time later, there were at least some answers, even if it wasn't the answer anyone wanted. Catherine's body was found on January 3, 1970 in southwest Baltimore County. The body was partially hidden by an embankment within a dump, her skull fractured by a blunt instrument. James Scannell, the first responder on the scene, said that it was a small plot where they normally burn trash and that the condition of her body indicated she had been there for a while. Yet, this was the only piece of the puzzle anyone had. She'd been murdered. That was it. All of my timelines say that, though the case was active for the next 7 years, relatively little evidence was found at the crime scene. Interviews were conducted, absolutely, but by the late 70s, the case went cold. Detectives got almost no new calls about her case, and the only facts of the case remained the same. She was abducted and she was killed. There was one piece of evidence that was preserved, and what was a cigarette found by the crime scene. And remember this because it will be important in a little bit. One journalist says that there is one detail, however, that always haunted him. The road to the dump isn't one that someone could casually drive by. It's not something you'd stumble across. Someone had to know this area. Someone knew where to dump Catherine's body. Tom Nugent, a journalist featured in The Keepers, claims that a girl at a school, a Jane Doe student as one article recalls, was even taken to Sesnick's body. That in of itself is terrifying. Nugent says that there's an on-the-record public story of what happened to Sister Cathy, but then the world beneath that was actually being lived. To get to that beneath, he said, is his greatest responsibility as a journalist. Now, in this documentary, Jane Doe has spoken out. Jean Wenner, our Jane Doe, says she believes Catherine was murdered because she knew too much. She knew about the dark events happening in Keogh, and she intended to speak out against them. Baltimore is considered to be the Catholic capital of the United States. The documentary talks about this a bit more in depth, but I'll just say that the first diocese of the US was founded in Baltimore, many communities were Catholic, and it's simply how many students were raised. You respect the church. Unfortunately, some priests saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of their students. Jean states in episode 2 of the miniseries, "My life would have been very different had I not gone into that confessional. I was a freshman. I got into confessional and told the priest something I was feeling very guilty about. I had been abused by an uncle when I was younger. He was sexually abusing me. I always remembered it was Magnus, and he always said, 'Can I look at you and what is your name?' At the end of it, he said, 'I don't know if God can forgive this. I'll have to pray more on this and I'll get back to you.' Probably a couple weeks later, Magnus walked up to me in the hall and said he wanted to meet me in his office. He proceeded to reiterate that I was so bad that it was going to take a while to answer if God could forgive me. If I emptied myself of these bad behaviors, it would make room for God to fill me with the Holy Spirit. He said that his come was the Holy Spirit and I was to swallow." After a couple of my therapy sessions with him, Maskell came in. He started very early on calling me a whore. They would do things to me, say, take the Holy Spirit through his penis. It was the beginning of some of the sickest confusion that could be imagined. And first of all, let me say to anyone here who has ever been sexually assaulted, you're not the one that should feel guilty. You didn't ask to be abused. I know it's so easy for me to just say this, and it's another thing to live it, but my heart absolutely breaks hearing Jean and how guilty she felt after what her uncle had done to her and how they took advantage of her. They knew about the power dynamic and they used it against her, acting as if they were messengers or godly men while molesting her. Ryan White, the director, says that not every story he heard of those who survived Maskell made it into the documentary. Some wanted to remain anonymous, yet he calls the stories he's heard chilling all the same. Another woman, Anne Mraz, who was at Keogh from 1968 to 1972, recalls going to Maskell for advice on teenage stuff, and he sexually abused her during her visits. Jean recalls that Sister Cathy, being young, approachable, and less authoritarian, was someone they could all go to. But even more important, she wasn't intimidated. Maskell gave these guidance sessions, and as Jean said, there was one occasion where Catherine actually told Maskell she didn't realize Jean had needed them. Catherine dared to question him. She knew what was going on, and one student claims to have told her that she didn't believe Maskell was particularly religious as he got physical in his office. Jean even directly told Cathy that she didn't like Keogh. When Cathy asked why, Jean didn't want to talk about it, so Sister Cathy asked Jean, "How about I ask why, and you shake or nod your head?" Jean agreed to this, and sure enough, Cathy asked Jean if the priests were making her do anything she didn't want to do. Jean nodded, and Cathy allegedly said she would take care of the situation. Unfortunately, Maskell had just about everyone under his thumb. He was the chaplain for the police department, the Air National Guard, for Maryland State Police, and his brother was a respected Baltimore policeman. He couldn't be touched. Jean even claims that Maskell would occasionally bring other men into the room to abuse her, and one of the men was a police officer, still in his uniform. Another former student, Donna, said she had the same experience. Apparently, she heard one of these officers saying, "I don't want to," but Maskell would encourage him. He was incredibly manipulative, selecting students that had been previously abused and using their weakness against them. One woman, Lillian, said when she was young she took records for Maskell. Every time she would write about these girls' case files, would type that Maskell would help these girls by taking them to gynecologists. even though whenever he did actually take anyone to a gynecologist, it was seemingly just to watch and find an excuse to administer prescribed douches with them in his office. Still, to those who didn't know the truth, this made him look like a fantastic priest, helping young girls when he was deliberately using his own abuse against them. This is around the time that Cathy and Russell began teaching in the public school to become reacquainted with the world. Some say that she was just taking a bit of time off before she would take her final vows, yet she hadn't forgotten about her former students at Keough. One anonymous student claims that she and her boyfriend arrived at Cathy's apartment the night before she vanished to visit her, and that this wasn't uncommon, as another student says she continued seeing Cathy after she left Keough a few months earlier. That night, she was talking to Cathy about the abuse when Father Magnus and Maskell barged into the apartment. Cathy sent her student out, and the next day in class, Maskell called this student into his office. He told her, "If you say anything, I'll kill you and your families." She didn't say a word, and she's still anonymous to this day in the documentary, as she's lived with fear her whole life. The same day Maskell told her this, Cathy went missing. In episode 6, though, the story from the anonymous student is disputed, since the student claims Sister Russell was there. As Coop states, it makes no sense that Russell wouldn't think to mention this when Cathy went missing. Perhaps she was hiding something too, but many don't think that's likely. Shortly afterwards, Jean too was called into Maskell's office. He told her that, "I know you were close to Sister Cathy, she's missing, but I know where she is. Do you want to see her?" According to Jean, Maskell drove her to the barren area and showed her Cathy's body. She knelt down in front of Cathy, naturally traumatized, and she states, "He leaned down real close to me and said, 'You see what happens when you say bad things about people.'" With this horrific story, the wide-scale abuse, the violence and pedophilia against these children, how wasn't he caught? I'm honestly getting the impression that among those who were abused at the school, it may well have been an open secret that you would legitimately die if you angered Maskell. How could the police not know? Well, it turns out there might be a few reasons here. But the first is that no one even seemed to recognize the abuse at Keough until 1992. In the 90s, Jean Weiner and Teresa Lancaster, known then as Jane Doe and Jane Roe, brought a $40 million lawsuit against the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Teresa Lancaster also tells her story in the documentary and how Maskell abused her as well. Jean was the first to step forward in the papers, but the Archdiocese didn't really take her all that seriously because there was no one to corroborate her story. However, after reaching out to all the alumni with anonymous postcards and giving them a phone number to call if they had any inappropriate experiences at Keough, Teresa came forward and named Maskell as her abuser. I won't go into any more graphic detail as we've heard a lot already, and I know it can be a lot to hear. The point is, Teresa and Jean teamed up against Maskell. And just to establish a brief timeline here of Maskell's actions, after the no-nonsense nun principal removed him from Keough, Maskell was sent to the Archdiocese Division of Schools from 1975 to 1980. The school records there were vague and have been described as the mystery years. From 1980 to 1982, he stopped working there and was at the Church of Annunciation. Then he worked at Holy Cross Parish in Baltimore, and he was there when the allegations came out. When they did, that's when, in 1992 and 1993, he was sent to Connecticut. This place in Connecticut was, well, where bishops sent priests that were pedophiles, so there's no other easy way to say that. L.M. Lothstein, the director at this institute, had put together a treatment program for distressed priests. The Archdiocese would say that the priests had been sent there for depression or authority problems, but to his surprise, that's not what the Archdiocese truly wanted to use his program for. One patient downright told him, "I'm not here for depression. I'm here because I had sex with a 14-year-old. I told it to the bishop and he sent me here." Rather than call the police or alert any authorities, that's what the Archdiocese used this facility for sending away problematic priests to protect the diocese from embarrassment of their arrest. L.M. Lothstein, speaking on behalf of the institute itself, said that it happened so many times they had to confront the Archdiocese and tell them they wouldn't accept any more patients sent to them unless they knew the real reason behind it and were given full access to their case file. According to Lothstein, "We never got a single referral again." However, just a year or two before the institution confronted them, that's exactly why Maskell went there, so he couldn't embarrass the Archdiocese. According to the Baltimore magazine titled "God Only Knows," Maskell professed his innocence. He denied ever abusing anybody and, according to a family member, even offered to take a lie detector test. The Archdiocese says this family source countered with more restrictive choices, either check into a Connecticut psychiatric facility or step down from the pulpit. Maskell looked at the Archbishop. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Go to Connecticut," said Keeler. Escorted back to Holy Cross, his parish in South Baltimore, Maskell was given just hours to pack a bag and leave the rectory. His disappearance from Baltimore was cloaked in secrecy. Even fellow priests were denied details. Maskell's mother learned something was wrong only after receiving phone calls asking the whereabouts of her son. To this day, Maskell believes the emerging scandal hastened his mother's death months later. A group of Towson lawyers said that in addition to these two plaintiffs, they met with 15 others who said Maskell subjected them to sexual violations. The lawyer that represented Jean and Teresa said that all in all, they heard from closer to 40 to 50 women. All of them, without prompting, named Maskell in their writings, and all of them had similar threads and stories of their abuse. And yet, infuriatingly, because when are stories like this ever handled properly, Maskell returned to ministry after 6 months at the Connecticut psychiatric facility. Thankfully though, the parishioners weren't having it. Even though the diocese thought that it would be perfectly acceptable to have a man accused of violating 17 women, with girls at the time, return to ministry, those at the church protested. Even though more than 500 priests were accused of sexual abuse since the 80s to when this article was written in 1995, these dioceses still didn't take it seriously. Other Keough alums also recall that Maskell presented himself as a sexual healer. Several women even say that the priest claimed to be an actual gynecologist. Anne, who doesn't wish to be named because "I still have a fear of the man," says Maskell invited her on a boat ride with some other girls. As they drove along the Beltway, she asked him where the other kids were and told they couldn't make it. They arrived at the boat, docked at the Dunlock area, and after helping her aboard, Maskell suggested they sit around and talk. At some point, she says, he told her about a church renovation project that unearthed, behind an old radiator, dozens of desiccated condoms. "I really don't think you should be talking to me about these kinds of things," she told him. He changed the subject, but after he lapsed into a description of sights he'd seen on Lover's Lane, Anne says she asked to be taken home. She stayed away from the priest, but about a year later, she discovered to her chagrin that Maskell was sitting opposite her in a confessional. She claims he quizzed her about her sex life, which at 14 was non-existent, and as she tried to answer his questions, she squeezed her eyes tight in the vain hope that he wouldn't see her. That was her last confession for 20 years. Finally, there was no escaping it this time. After a couple survivors stepped forward, the rest came flooding in. This article from 1995 describes Jean telling Cathy exactly as she did in the documentary. Only her name here is Jennifer for legal protections, I'd assume. Though the lawsuit was dismissed because the statute of limitations expired, the Archdiocese couldn't avoid what had happened with Maskell forever. Apparently, he resigned and fled to Ireland in 1994, but authorities in Ireland were informed about his history and Maskell returned to Baltimore just a couple years later. His name was finally added to a list of clergy credibly accused of abuse on the Archdiocese website in 2002, and over $500,000 were paid out in counseling assistance and financial assistance to those who had been abused by Maskell, including Lancaster and Wenner. Though all that took years and wasn't officially paid out until 2011. Maskell died in 2001, so it's a shame he couldn't have faced the fallout from having his name added, but it should have been added far sooner anyway, and at least he can't hurt anyone else ever again. And I understand too, some of you might say that all of this is just alleged, but there are multiple reasons to believe these women and many similar testimonies. One article even states that Jean was able to prove and provide details about Cathy's body that were only known to investigators at the time. Not to mention that Maskell even buried records in Holy Cross Cemetery back in 1990, certainly not the act of an innocent man. Also, has he ever heard of this thing called a paper shredder or like a fire? I'm pretty sure there were better ways to eliminate records back then. Some may argue or believe that because some of his victims didn't step forward until years later when they began remembering this, that it could be these women deciding to lie and defame Maskell. However, I do believe Jean when she says that she simply disassociated, separated herself from it, and forced herself to forget. This can happen with trauma, and it is not uncommon. While implanting false memories may happen too, the amount of evidence and testimony against Maskell is telling at best and damning at worst. So before we continue onward to discuss the cover-up and why it took so long, this is where we're going to take a quick break to thank today's sponsors if we have any for this episode, which I don't know if we do, but if we do, they will be right here. What do you want to eat tonight? Maybe you want a home-cooked favorite, but don't feel like going to the store? Or maybe you want something exciting and new, but it would be great to stay in for the night. Well, DoorDash connects you with everything you want, whenever and however you want it. And along with the restaurants you love, you can now get groceries and other essential items delivered with DoorDash. Get drinks, snacks, and other household items delivered to you in under an hour. Maybe you're just craving some late-night ice cream or donuts. Maybe you forgot that one key ingredient for dinner. Or maybe you just need to stock up for the week. And with DoorDash, you can get everything in one app. With over 300,000 partners, you can support your neighborhood go-tos or choose from your favorite national restaurants. And ordering is always easy, and your items will be left safely outside your door when you choose contactless delivery drop-off. And for a limited time, our listeners can get 25% off and zero delivery fees on their first order of $15 or more when you download the DoorDash app and enter code PRISM. That's 25% off up to a $10 value and zero delivery fees on your first order when you download the DoorDash app in the App Store and enter code PRISM. Don't forget, that's code PRISM for 25% off your first order with DoorDash. Subject to change and terms apply. So the big question here is, why did all of this take so long? Where were the police in this? And how was this just ignored for literal decades? Even though some justice has been done here, though not nearly a fraction of enough, how did this go unheard of until the 90s? Well, now we're on to our second reason for why Maskell may have gotten away with murder: a cover-up. And I know, many of you hear the word cover-up and think that I'm about to go get my tinfoil hat on and roll your eyes considering how overused that word is, but hear me out. I will say that this is speculation, as the former state's attorney has said that there simply wasn't enough evidence to go to trial on this. However, even if that's the case, many question the prosecutor in charge of the Maryland State Attorney's Office Sex Abuse Unit for complete lack of action. Sharon May has been widely criticized ever since The Keepers came out. WMAR News in Baltimore obtained footage of the 1994 dig when the documents that Maskell buried were uncovered, according to their website. The WMAR video also includes a brief soundbite with the man who buried the documents, former Holy Cross Cemetery employee William Story. The only word I got was to forget what went on that day. After it was over, I closed in the pit. I was told to just forget it. It doesn't involve me other than opening the hole, he said at the time. The tape containing the video has been on a shelf in a storage room at ABC2 News, most likely since the day it was shot, August 10, 1994. The handwritten label reads, "Priest Paper Burial." For retired teacher Gemma Hoskins, the video is the very definition of a needle in the haystack. Flabbergasted, dumbfounded, she said. "Where has this been? It's something that we've heard about and now we're looking at it." The dig is a key moment in The Keepers. Hoskins and Ann Schaub, along with some of the abuse survivors and investigators they worked with, sat down with a former Baltimore City police detective, who is identified only as Deep Throat. "One of the boxes that I saw had girls with their shirts open, exposing their breasts," he said. "And then there were records in there talking about this individual girl, like a profile, clearly in high school." Even with the women's claims and the documents from the dig, the Baltimore City State's attorney in charge of sex crimes at the time, Sharon May, still chose not to charge Father Maskell with child sexual abuse. She also did an interview with producers of The Keepers. "It was wet. It had to be dried out and sorted through," May said. "But to my recollection, there was nothing found that went right to, oh, Maskell molested these kids," she said. But our video shows the bags and papers left behind after the dig. And even after being buried for 4 years with the boxes police took away, you can almost read them. So, for my own understanding, let me get this straight. There's a box buried in the cemetery, known to have been buried by Maskell. It's literally labeled Priest Paper Burial, and in it are photos of girls exposing their breasts. And she says there's nothing that went to, oh, he may have molested them? If May was saying that they couldn't pursue the case because of the statute of limitations, I would understand why her hands are tied there. But to just lie like that, like she just seemingly stuck her head so far into the sand that people are accusing her of corruption. And Maskell has hardly faced consequences for these actions, first of all. But secondly, even if you don't think that we can be sure he did this, innocent until proven guilty, the fact that May wouldn't even look into this further is incredibly upsetting. And to be frank, her callousness in the documentary is obvious. Sharon even dodges questions asked of her with the typical, "I don't recall if we found any pornographic material, maybe we did, I just don't remember that," before denying that any photographs themselves were ever found. Even May herself says that deep in the recesses of her mind, she believes that Maskell was responsible. Why else would the church move him around? Why else was he unavailable? Why else would he get rid of his records? She simply didn't have enough to charge him. I think it's pretty clear that I don't like May, but I'll admit that I do have a bias right here, right now, since I'm pretty upset knowing that justice is not really going to be included in how this story ends. So what about the Catholic Church? May points to them and says that the church itself was incredibly powerful. Jean and Teresa argue the questions asked by the church's defense were designed to beat them down, and more disturbingly, it said that the bishops such as Francis Maloney would lie on Maskell's behalf. Delaware Online discusses the allegations against him portrayed in the documentary and writes, "In the last episode, Dr. Charles Franz, a dentist in Maryland, describes a meeting with Maloney to discuss allegations that Maskell abused Franz when he was a child. Maloney said the meeting occurred at Franz's Catonsville dental office in October 1994, soon after Maskell's victims began suing the church. Franz recalls Maloney going to the meeting with two canon lawyers and telling him the meeting was so important that the archbishop would have been present had he not been in Rome. Maloney denied that any lawyers were present and said he told Franz the archbishop would have attended if he could to express his apology and to reach out personally, had he not been in Rome at the time. Franz said that at the end of the meeting, Maloney asked him, "Well, what do you want, Charlie?" and then mentioned a boat. "Do I want a boat?" Franz said in the documentary. "No, I don't want a boat. I'll tell you what I would like to see. Just do what's right." Maloney denied offering Franz a boat. Maloney recalled offering counseling and spiritual assistance and encouraging Franz to report the information to the state's attorney. "At no time did I offer Dr. Franz a boat," Maloney said. Franz said his mother made a report about Maskell to the archdiocesan authorities in Baltimore in the 1960s. But the Archdiocese of Baltimore said it did not learn of the abuse until victims came forward in the 1990s. Unsurprisingly, Maloney has spoken out and denied everything. He claims that he was just a college student in 1967, so he couldn't have known about this report. Even if Maloney wasn't aware of the abuse until the 90s though, it's the actions that he and the Archdiocese took that are incredibly disturbing. Nothing was reported to the police. Maskell was simply sent away on a little trip to Connecticut to not make them look bad. He vanished to Ireland when things did start to look bad, and Jean was silenced yet again. Don't get me wrong, the Archdiocese eventually paid a few $100,000, but the Maskell lawsuit was lost. And of course, even aside from the church, there's also the OBGYN that was involved, Dr. Richter, who allowed Father Maskell to bring these girls into his office and even partake in the sexual abuse. All we do know is that Maskell had people on his side, willing to defend him, seemingly willing to do anything for him, perhaps willing to kill for him too. A man only known as Brother Bob was also violent with the girls and brought into his office, Jean believes, and that's the one that killed Cathy. He allegedly told Jean this one day in Maskell's office and told her that it should have been you. There's been a lot of speculation as to who this Brother Bob is, as to who was helping Maskell commit these awful crimes in general. Jean unfortunately says that she can't remember his face. Some believe that it may have been a man named Robert Flaherty, a man who lived in Baltimore around the time and years later was also involved in a sex abuse scandal. We have no way of knowing this for sure though, and the information about Robert Flaherty is minimal. Others, like those in the documentary, point to a man named Edgar Davidson being a suspect in episode 5. There's a lot of evidence that does make people believe Edgar was involved, as his ex-wife claims that he came home with his shirt bloody that night and he was set on buying new tires right away, potentially to cover up his own muddy tire tracks. He also gave her a necklace that had a wedding bell on it when, according to her, he didn't normally give gifts like that, nor was the stone on it even her birthstone. It turns out, however, that it was Cathy's sister's fiance's birthstone, so it's likely that this was an engagement gift that Cathy had bought that was never recovered. Not to mention, he drove with both feet, something incredibly rare, and Cathy's killer, based on the evidence in her car, also drove with both feet. More and more, it looked like someone had perhaps killed Cathy on Maskell's behalf. Edgar also has a history of preying on middle school girls not far from Cathy's apartment. More alarmingly still is that Cathy wasn't the only one to go missing around this time. In more recent years, according to my source. Police have also said they're investigating possible connections with the murders of 3 other women whose bodies were found in areas near Cessnick. 20-year-old Joyce Helen Malecki, who disappeared 4 days after Cessnick, her story is also examined in The Keepers. 16-year-old Pamela Lynn Conyers, who went missing in 1970, and 16-year-old Grace Elizabeth Gay Montagne, who disappeared in 1971. All 4 women went missing from shopping areas during the same time period, according to police, but their bodies were found in different law enforcement jurisdictions, which delayed linking the cases for many years. None of the cases are solved. So, could these cases be connected? Could it be that whoever murdered Cathy had no idea who Father Maskell was? Sure, potentially. But if that's the case, then how would Father Maskell have shown Jean her body? This seems to point to Maskell hiring or ordering someone to murder Cathy. Maybe whoever did it decided that they wanted to do it again of their own accord and continued murdering young women in the area. That's possible. And again, this is all pure speculation, so I want to make that clear that I don't know what actually happened. One woman, a niece of Billy Schmidt, said that her uncle Billy may have done it as he lived right next door, only steps from Cathy's apartment. Billy's sister-in-law, the niece's mom Ronnie, says that she always found it so strange that Cathy lived directly across from Billy, and when the body was found, it was directly behind their family business. She even says that she remembers her husband, Billy's brother, coming home one night with blood on his hands, his forearms, and his shirt. After that night, seemingly out of nowhere, he started drinking, gambling, doing drugs when he'd never acted that way before. Bill, too, became a hermit and strangely started becoming obsessed with Catholicism. He started raving about a woman in the attic, and when Ronnie went to the attic to show him that there wasn't anyone in the attic, she found a mannequin up there, a mannequin in a nun's outfit. Billy would say that she was chasing him, trying to get him, and after Ronnie said he couldn't take it anymore, Bill took his own life. Maybe this is all just circumstantial evidence, but that's all we have. It's all we know. And quite frankly, I do believe that someone else had something to do with this, that Father Maskell did not act alone. Remember that cigarette butt I mentioned earlier, the one found near her body? Well, with new attention to the case and advances in technology, it was DNA tested. According to one 2017 source, perhaps the most interesting aspect of The Keepers is how Cessnick's cold case is unfolding now off-screen. Earlier this month, Baltimore police announced they exhumed Father Maskell's body from a cemetery in February for DNA testing, but they said it had nothing to do with the Netflix release. This week, authorities revealed the priest's DNA does not match evidence near Cessnick's body and that the results don't necessarily clear him as a suspect. Our best hope for solving this case at this point lies with the people who are still alive, a police spokesperson said. We hope that someone will be able to come forward with conclusive information about the murder. This could mean that Father Maskell had nothing to do with it, or it could mean that he had help. Or it could mean the cigarette was literally just there and had nothing to do with Cathy whatsoever. The fact is that the case is still ongoing. The fact is that there are still many people speaking out and making allegations against Maskell in 2017, and that is absolutely stunning. This absolutely has not been forgotten. Bill's nephew has also spoken up, said that he knows his uncle had something to do with it. He remembers his Uncle Bill and Bill's partner, a man named Skippy, taking a massive rolled-up carpet behind the family business, and he believes that Cathy was in it. Edgar apparently called a radio show to claim that he knew a man with Cessnick's rosary case after she died, and now in the documentary he claims that was a lie. He was dumb and stupid, he says, and let his wife believe that he was somehow involved when he wasn't. And perhaps Edgar is making things up for attention, letting someone accuse him because he thought he could get away with it or just wanted the attention. It doesn't make any sense. It's just weird. Unfortunately, since Pete McKeon doesn't say much and since Russell passed away, most of the information about that night comes from him. However, they had ticket stubs for a movie the two men saw that night. Their alibi has been described as airtight, so it doesn't seem like we're going to have any more answers in that regard. Koob claims one detective that was questioning him even handed him Cathy's genitals wrapped in a newspaper, as if to justify his intensive questions. Other than Koob, however, the story was pretty much widely been called nonsense. There's been other pieces of evidence that are important and have been brought up within the documentary, such as the letter Marilyn had postmarked a day after Cathy went missing. She turned it over to police, however. That letter was lost. It was no longer kept as evidence. Jean said that when she was taken to see Cathy's body, there were maggots in it, while the first responding officer says that there were no maggots on her body and there couldn't be because it was winter. Yet, in the autopsy report, there were maggots present. During this time in November, it could have been warm enough. The point is, we have no idea what happened for sure, and tragically, we may never know. As twisted, fascinating, and convoluted as this story is, what's important to remember here is that a life was lost, and those close to her, like her sister Marilyn, are still grieving her loss to this day. If you do want to learn more information about the entire situation, I do recommend the documentary The Keepers. To some extent, I feel like I've only been able to cover just a fraction of the case. Whether or not Maskell actually killed Cathy or arranged to have Cathy killed, he was a horrible man with an alarming amount of defenders. But with all of that being said, that's where I'm ending today's episode of Prism of the Past. I hope you learned something new. Thank you for spending a couple minutes out of your day with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!